you for having me. I don't know if there was a rumor that I bit or that I had COVID, but some of you are so far away from me, I'm starting to wonder what you heard. So if you want to read the screen, you might want to come forward, because I have a lot of slides with a lot of information. What if I tell you I have a $100 bill waiting for you if you come up here? Wow. Okay, well maybe, that sitting far in the back of a room can be a sign of mental unwellness too. So, no, I'm just teasing. Except for Katie, she's good. Actually, I'm glad you brought up that it's Mental Health Awareness Month. A lot of people don't realize how important mental health is, and I agree with what you were saying, because one of the things I've often considered is that I think the mind is the last battlefield we're going to have to fight on with Satan. And I don't think a lot of people are putting enough awareness into that. So even secularly, mental health is important, but spiritually, mental health is also important. And so I'm glad that we're doing things like this. It's too bad that we only have 1 month to talk about these things, but that's okay, we can talk about it. But, as we take care of ourselves, one of the most beautiful things I get to see is not just when I'm teaching somebody something, but when somebody goes, wow, everybody in your office seems so happy. I want some of that too. So sometimes we can witness without even saying anything to people, just by our own mental well-being when everybody else seems to be suffering. And on a similar note to that, I don't know if any of you had heard this, but the first year that COVID happened, it started in March, and up through November, did you know that the suicide rate in Placer County was higher than the COVID death rate? Yeah. And so nobody was really talking about that, were they? But a lot of people are still at home and have not left their houses. They're getting all their Uber food and their groceries, online and through delivery services and stuff. And a lot of people are really scared. And so they're staying home. But that can be a sign of even mental health too, how we respond to these sorts of things. So I want to share, the title is called Bouncing Back, Resiliency and Grit Training of Children. And of course, you can get one of these nice little flyers in the back to see all the other topics, the 2 other topics we're going to be covering this weekend. But I want to share with you, I'm seeing a few kids and what it looks like maybe some grandparents in here, so you can go home and teach your grandkids too, besides just the parents being here. But these are some of the things that we're going to look at. We're going to understand the problems affecting children and adolescents in today's progressive culture. We're going to identify biblical examples of grit and resiliency, and we're going to learn ways parents and professionals, or grandparents, can build resiliency and grit in children and adolescents today. So let's start with this, some research. Bouncing back from failure turns out to be one of the best lessons a kid can learn. Get this. In fact, according to Angela Duckworth, PhD, she's actually the leading expert on this, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, that skill, resiliency and grit, along with certain other character traits she calls grit, matters more to a child's ability to reach his full potential than intelligence, skill, or even grades. What do we often focus on, though? All of those, and not the resiliency and grit part. Duckworth has been studying the role character plays in success since 2005. She followed adults, West Point cadets, national spelling bee champions, and students at elite universities. In every single case, how many cases? Every single case, she found that grit, not intelligence or academic achievement, was the most reliable predictor of positive outcome. Why aren't we teaching kids this? We're doing MCAT and we're doing all these other things and study groups and everything, but we're not teaching resiliency and grit. But this is really, really important. So let's look, before we touch on this a little bit more, I want to show you some of the challenges affecting kids today. And these are all things that I see in my therapy sessions, things I've read about, and so on. But one of the big ones is an emphasis on feelings or focusing on happiness. Even adults do this. We focus on how we're feeling. We don't focus on duty or purpose or things like that. And what winds up happening? Well, interestingly, whatever makes me happy now, will that necessarily make me happy long term? No. Chocolate cake makes me very happy right now. But if I don't stop eating it, how am I going to feel later? Not very happy, and probably a little bloated and sick. So passive parenting, this is another thing. Even in the media, or helicopter and lawnmower parenting. So on the one side we have passive parenting, and on the other side we have helicopter and lawnmower parenting. When I was growing up, a very popular television show that I watched was Little House on the Prairie. Anybody watch Little House on the Prairie? One thing that I've noticed from the time that I was watching my Little House on the Prairie to the shows now is how little parents are involved in their and talk through the situation and try to resolve it. They would offer encouragement, support, maybe a lesson or two. Nowadays, though, where are the parents? I saw an article on a mother put this article up, and she was talking about how parents are portrayed even in Disney shows. They're portrayed as like their child's best friend if they're around. And I remember she talked about how these girls showed up at a coffee shop, and they were like 12 years old. The show is about 12-year-old girls, or teeny bopper, early teens. And how did they get to the coffee shop? They couldn't drive, but they would just show up there and you'd see them, but no parent drove them there. You didn't see parents involved at all in the different aspects of their lives. The teachers weren't really involved in the school situations and stuff. And so a lot of kids don't understand lessons and things about life because they don't expect their parents to be involved. And so who are they learning from? Their peers. How much experience do their peers have? They're learning too. They're trying to figure things out too. Another thing is instant gratification. And this goes into the next one, social influencers, media, cyberbullying. I had no clue what kids had to deal with today until I've talked to so many young people, not even teenagers yet, even middle school kids are being bullied and shamed by their friends online, not just in person. When I was growing up, we didn't have online. So there's no other way to talk about each other except in person, or a letter, or over the phone if you could get a hold of them, because there wasn't a lot of, you couldn't even leave a message when I was early on in school. You had to keep calling until they picked up. But now everything is instant. When I was growing up too, I remember we had a TV and it had like 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13 channels. How many channels do kids have now? You had to wait over a week to watch your show. Now you can binge watch the whole season without going to bed at night. You go the whole 24 hours to get your show in. So we have a lot of instant gratification. Another thing too is politics. How divided is politics now? You'd think everybody hated each other, right? And then you go online and you hear even more how much people hate each other. And everybody's instigating another fight all the time. I remember one time I posted something on Facebook and I had somebody respond to it based on something that was going on in the media, and I had no idea that that was going on, and I didn't know that my post was going to trigger somebody to think something that I hadn't even crossed my mind. And I simply responded, "Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was going on," and then they cooled off after that, but I almost started World War III over it, and I didn't even know what I had said wrong. And of course, the pandemic. You know, when you think about it, a child who's 6 years old, a third of their life has been spent in a pandemic, watching people with masks and everything else. being at home exponentially more, not going out and that sort of thing. Focus on money. A lot of people focus on money and luxury this and celebrity that. Medications and mental illness. This is increasing more too. I'm actually going to help you keep your kids away from mental illness and medications and stuff by some of the things that we talk about, but also fantasy versus reality. I just had somebody today in my group tell me about a movie that they recently watched that had all of these realities going on at the same time. It was the same person, but in this reality they were in this role, and then in that reality, I think there were 4 different realities that were going on at the same time. And I thought, I hope that's not going on, because life is complex enough. I don't need to think about all the other places I might be at the same time doing different roles and stuff. But have you ever been to Barnes & Noble? Have you ever been to the young adult or teen section? It is one of the most depressing places I've ever been. Seeing all the types of literature that are out there, they're all the same themes, magic and sorcery and all these sort of like dark themed things. And I had to leave because I couldn't look at it anymore. It was so sad. And these are the things that bog down kids. And what do we like to say? Oh, as long as they're reading. But what if they're reading things that are causing their mental illness and causing them to be more discouraged and hopeless? And another thing that a lot of these reading materials cover too is dystopic themes, where there's like the end of the world and one person has to come out from it and fight for us. But who do we know is already taking care of that? God. We don't have to worry about taking on the world ourselves or vicariously living through some superhero. But then also spirituality and religion. The longer we go, the less and less important this seems in society too. A lot of kids, even adults, I'm noticing, have a perspective of religion and spirituality. I call it potluck religion. Well, I like this, what the Buddhists do, and I like this, what the Christians do, and I like this from my Catholic growing up experience and all these things. And so I'm going to take all the things I like and make my own religion out of it and my own spirituality out of it. How confusing is that, though? I even hear parents say things like, well, I don't want to teach my kids anything. I want them to grow up and figure out what they like for themselves. Do you know how many religions you'd have to go through to figure out which one you like the most? It's almost better to give them the wrong one than to give them just carte blanche with all of the ones in the world. So these are some of the things that kids are dealing with that maybe we didn't notice that they're dealing with. But I also want to talk about some biblical examples from the Bible that talk about resiliency and grit, even in the midst of some of these things that kids even in the Bible were experiencing. So the first one I want to talk about is Samuel. I like reading stories from the Bible from a therapist perspective, because if you haven't already figured out, God cares about our minds. He really cares about our minds. And if you ever want to do a study, just look up the words thoughts, think, or thinking, and imaginations. And you'll see so much in the Bible of how God cares about how we think and what we're focused on. But Samuel, he had a mother who, through self-sacrifice and great care, taught her son the difference between good and evil from a very early age. She didn't withhold the idea of evil from him. She actually taught him about those things. And she herself had been treated unkindly and probably taught Samuel resilience in response to evil and focus on God's goodness and care. This is one of the things a lot of parents think they have to do, is protect their kids from everything bad. Actually, sometimes bad things can actually be a good way to teach something out of it too. Even if they're not going through it, sometimes you can even tell stories of things that you've been through, age appropriate and when they're ready. But Samuel was able to, because of these things, Samuel was able to stay pure in the face of poor influences in Eli's home, and he had some big brother figures that weren't doing so well, and the sanctuary, and even he was made an exception to the priestly duties as a child. Did you know that he was given the responsibility of being a priest and having priestly duties even though he was only a child? How many of you would let your child be a priest in the sanctuary right now? How many of you think they would be responsible enough to do it? How about Joseph? This is my favorite story in the Bible. Jacob had his own struggles with learning to trust in God amid trials and even mistakes. Remember the story of Jacob and the mistakes that he made? Yeah. Joseph must have called upon these lessons at the feet of Jacob, because who did Jacob come from? Ultimately, Abraham. And what did God tell Abraham he was supposed to do with his children? Teach them God's ways and his providences and all of his protective care and everything. Remind his children. And I think this was passed down too. So when he was in the face of abuse and persecution, he was able to recall those stories. So Joseph, while treated poorly by his brothers, he was able to stay true to what God had shown him in his dreams and stood for the promises fulfilled in those prophecies. He was a shepherd and took care of sheep with all its duties and responsibilities too. Do you know how many times nowadays we tell our kids, I just want you to focus on school? And we eliminate all the other things that they could be learning from too. I think it's really important that we let kids have jobs. I'll get to that a little bit later. Adversity in childhood prepared Joseph for adversity and hardship in adulthood. David, through experience as a young boy tending sheep, David was able to learn to trust in God and stood up to wild animals even affecting his care of his sheep. David was bold in the face of the giants and called upon God to defend him. David, while having human frailties and temptations, was humble to his sins and confessed and turned from his sin. David, did you know David was called perfect? Isn't that interesting? I was like, why, God, why would you call him perfect in your eyes? It wasn't because he didn't do anything wrong. It was because every time he did do something wrong, he actually humbled himself and confessed that and turned from his ways. But he went through hardships in the process of that. David was patient with Saul after learning from Abigail. She was a vessel speaking for God. And David learned from his mistakes and avoided temptation later on in his deathbed. I love a quote that I've heard from Ellen White. I wish I knew exactly where it was, but sometimes we get discouraged because we're constantly being tempted or going through difficulties and trials and stuff, and we think, God, why are you... I'm actually taking some creative liberties with what she says, but we'll say things like, God, why are you letting this happen to me? And while we think God is doing it because he may be harsh, she says he's actually doing it so that we'll gain victory over those things. And so whatever we think is too hard for us, God's already, weighed those things and recognizes that maybe sometimes we need to keep going through those things to build resiliency and grit and learn from those. So how do we role model grit to our kids? I love this. How many of you have ever heard of Spanx? Probably ladies. Maybe I think I saw a man raise his hand. This is the founder of Spanx, and I love the story she tells of growing up. So this is what she says. At the end of the week, my dad would ask my brother and me what we failed at. If I didn't have something to tell him, he was disappointed. So basically, every day she came home from school, she and her brother came home from school, and her dad would sit at the table with all of them, and he would get really excited, like, what did you fail at today? How many of you grew up with that experience? And he would be disappointed. What? You didn't fail at anything today? And they'd go, okay, well, I failed at this. What was he doing? Teaching them not to fear failure. What happens when we fear failure? We stop trying. We don't want to try anymore. Is resiliency and grit about stopping or trying, even when we fail? It's about trying. Here's a quote from Ellen White. Let the child and the youth be taught that every mistake, every fault, every difficulty conquered becomes a stepping stone to better and higher things. It is through such experiences that all who have ever made life worth the living have achieved success. Should we be afraid of mistakes? Are little babies afraid of making mistakes when they're learning to walk? Are we afraid when they fall? What do most people do when a baby takes their first step and falls? Oh my goodness, they took a step. I can't believe it. Good job, good job, good job. What did they just do though? They took a step and fell. Why, when our kids get older, do we become so discouraged when they fail? Or teach them that this is a scary thing when they do it? What if we got just as excited and said, good job, way to go? I had a friend when her daughter would fall or tumble or hurt herself or something, her daughter, you know what little kids do when they fall? Even before they cry, what do? They look up and see what your response is. They want to know, what am I supposed to do right now? And what do a lot of parents do? Oh, are you okay? I'm sorry. So sad. Are you okay? But you know what she did? She'd go, bingo, good job, yay. And her kid would look up and go, oh, I guess it's okay. I'm not hurt. I'm okay. And she would do that. Well, let's hear from a captain of moonshots, Astro Teller from Google. He says, you must reward people for failing, he says. If not, they won't take risks and make breakthroughs. If you don't reward failure, people will hang on a doomed idea for fear of the consequences. That wastes time and saps an organization's spirit. So there's a background story to this. Did you know what Google did with their employees? They offered $20,000 for any employee who would share a failure they had in a project they were doing at work. How many of you would take advantage of that $20,000 to share your failure? Good for you if you would. Do you know why they did that? Anybody want to guess? You learn from your mistakes. That's a very good answer. It's not the answer though. How much money does a company lose when somebody makes a mistake or fails at taking a project to fruition, and because of that failure or because they don't like what happened, they're either afraid to tell anybody or they stuff it in a drawer because they're ashamed that they didn't get something good out of it. And so what happens is then if somebody else tries to do it, they have to start at the beginning. So by having somebody get up in front of the whole company and share all the steps that they took to get to their failure, what do you think is going to happen? Somebody in the company is going to see that and go, I know what they could do. And now they don't have to start from scratch, and it saves that company even more than $20,000 in order to get that to come to success. But it has to start with people not being afraid to fail. And where do we learn this? In our childhood, more often than not. It's okay to fail sometimes. Here's another Ellen White quote. Children frequently begin a piece of work with enthusiasm, but becoming perplexed or wearied with it, they wish to change and take hold of something new. Thus they may take hold of several things, meet with a little discouragement, and give them up, and so they pass from one thing to another, perfecting nothing. Parents should not allow the love of change to control their children. A few words of encouragement or a little help at the right time may carry them over their trouble and discouragement, and the satisfaction they will derive from seeing the task completed that they undertook will stimulate them to greater exertion. What do you think of that? I don't even think Ellen White understood what was actually happening even biologically when kids are encouraged to continue with something. It's called dopamine. The only way to get dopamine is to work. Do you know so many people in this day and age, they want dopamine without work? How do you get dopamine without work? Artificially from drugs. And do you know one of the reasons why so many people have a hard time getting off drugs? Is because your body learns not to produce dopamine because it gets it artificially, whereas it could do it itself. But the problem is it never wants to take the time to do it. And when you don't use something, you lose it. And so when you're constantly using artificial means to get dopamine, what do you lose? The ability to make it on your own. So a lot of people, when they're going through recovery, they don't feel anything. They feel numb. And they give up. because they're not getting that dopamine. So here's a healthy person test. What is your ability to use creative problem solving in a difficulty or challenge? Do you give up, or do you use creative problem solving? Do you keep trying? What did Edison say? I didn't fail. I found 999 ways the light bulb didn't work. So here's one of the things that we can do to help build resiliency and grit. Ask questions. Do you know sometimes parents like to answer their kids and automatically just tell them because it's faster? But what happens if we ask them a question, like, how would you figure this out? What would you do in this case? Mom is having a hard time with this. Do you have any ideas what we could do? Or Dad's having trouble figuring this out. What would you do? What if you ask kids these things and let them help creatively problem solve? Then they learn to do that later on when they're going through difficulties and challenges, and they're not afraid to do it. Socratic questioning helps patients, this is the study, helps patients examine the validity of their negative thoughts and gain a broader, more realistic perspective. This is actually one of the ways that I practice therapy, is instead of just answering a problem for my clients, I ask them, hey, if you looked at it this way, what would you see? Or how would you think about it? And it's interesting how nobody ever gave them the option to look at it another way, and then when they're encouraged to do that, they can often come up with different ways of seeing things they never thought about. Another thing, don't make it about money. Goals are great, but not all goals. A lot of kids have goals. They want to make a lot of money. They want to be famous, that kind of thing. So money, beauty, and admiration were shown to lead to lesser feelings of satisfaction, this study says. Craving money and adoration also can lead to a preoccupation with keeping up with the Joneses, or upward social comparisons that breed feelings of inadequacy and jealousy. And unlike the lasting benefits of caring relationships and hard-earned skills, the thrill of extrinsic accomplishments fade quickly. All too soon, the salary raise is a distant memory and the rave review forgotten. Here's another quote from Ellen White. She was on the ball in the 1800s. She knew what she was talking about. She should be the psychologist. She should have gotten an honorary psychology degree. The circumstances in which a child is placed will often have a more effective influence on him than even the examples of the parents. Sometimes we feel bad as parents, like, oh, I didn't do this right. Why didn't I do that? But what often is more influential on kids than just the parents? Circumstances they're placed in. There are wealthy men who expect their children to be what they were in their youth and blame the depravity of the age if they are not. Do you know what modern way of saying this is? Why aren't kids today the way we were when we were growing up? That's how you should translate that when you hear that. But they have no right to expect this of their child unless they place them in the circumstances similar to those in which they themselves have lived. The circumstances of the father's life have made him what he is. In his youth, he was pressed with poverty and had to work with diligence and perseverance. His character was molded in the stern school of poverty. He was forced to be modest in his wants, active in his work, simple in his tastes. He had to put his faculties to work in order to obtain food and clothing. He had to practice economy. Fathers labor to place their children in a position of wealth rather than where they themselves began. This is a common mistake. Had children today to learn in the same school in which their fathers learned, they would become as useful as they. Don't we often want our kids so bad, though? Why would we want them to have differently if we didn't turn out so bad? The fathers have altered the circumstances of their children. We could just as easily say mothers, too. Poverty was the father's master. Abundance of means surrounds the son. All his wants are supplied. His father's character was molded under the severe discipline of frugality. Every trifling good was appreciated. His son's habits and character will be formed not by the circumstances which once existed, but by the present situation, ease, and indulgence. So let's go back to Angela Duckworth. She says these are some of the things that we can do. Her book offers these encouragements. So one, offer a challenge. If you haven't seen this already online, I found this very archaic looking age-appropriate chores for children. So even at the age of 2, you can do very productive things. I've seen even younger children do this. If they can walk and pick up things, they can often help. You can find this online too if you want to, because it's kind of small. But what else can we do? We can promote perseverance. Just like Ellen White said, encourage them, keep them going at a task. Don't let them get so frustrated that they move on to something else. Encourage them to stay with it. Be a nudge, not a nag, but a nudge. When your kid has trouble, encourage them. Just say, you can do this, keep going. Welcome boredom and frustration. Do you know what happens in boredom and frustration? Creativity. I loved when I was growing up. So when my brother was born, I'm the oldest of 4 and my brother's the youngest of 4. When he was born, it was right before I turned 9. And so it was probably about the age of 9. I remember my parents used to buy these really big boxes of diapers. And so they didn't have to keep going and buying them because you know how many you go through. And I would take my brother's diaper boxes and I turned those into a dollhouse. I had 2 on the bottom and 1 on top of it, and I made my own furniture. My mom would give me scraps and things like that. I didn't actually play with dolls. I wasn't interested in that. I just wanted to build the dollhouse out of it. And I spent so much time in my room, and my mom would give me little pieces of scrap to cover the foam, or pieces of fabric to cover the foam and make the couch and all those sorts of things. And I had so much fun doing that. I wished I had kind of kept it. It was probably not that cute, but I was so impressed that I built my own dollhouse, though. It was the best thing. And it wasn't the cutest. It wasn't the most structurally sound dollhouse, but man, the satisfaction that I had, that was probably my first real taste of dopamine. At about 9 years old. I had it big time. I wasn't going back after that. But let them fall and model resilience. Do you know what happens to kids when they hear their parents always discouraged and complaining? Think about it. If you're a little kid and you see your parents always discouraged and complaining about everything, what do you come to think about when you get older? Do you think it's going to be a good experience being an adult? I think that might be one of the reasons a lot of kids want to end their lives. Because why would I want to be my parents' age when all I see them is struggle and be frustrated? One of the best things that you can do for your kid is offer them hope. Is let them know that there's hope. Man, being an adult is great. You know, the independence and everything, and I get to solve problems. Like, yeah, finances might be difficult, but you know, we're going to figure this out. It'll be fun. Let's see what we can do. Versus, oh, here we go again. I had to go to work today, and my boss was too difficult, and all that sort of thing. What does a kid hear? Hope versus discouragement. So, here's another author. I really like this author. She was a single mom, and she actually worked with juvenile delinquents, if you want to call them that. And what I like is that she really encouraged parents to trust the process. Sometimes parents are actually quite impatient. When their kids are struggling, they want to jump in and take care of it. But she says, our peace of mind lies in our ability to trust the process. If you're discouraged because your kid is discouraged, then maybe be patient and let them figure out. Oftentimes it's not as urgent for them to figure it out as we think it is. But they will eventually figure it out if we trust the process. Another thing we can encourage kids with is purity and nature. Nature is usually in a state of flux, which fosters problem-solving opportunities that build self-confidence. Now, I didn't grow up in the country. The only country I had was, like I said earlier, Little House on the Prairie. So, but one of the things I remembered about Little House on the Prairie is oftentimes, what was Pa's job besides working at the lumber mill? Was I the only one who watched Little House on the Prairie? Maybe. Okay. Maybe I'm right in the middle of everybody's age bracket. Anyway, he was a farmer. And I remember so many times, like, the rain would come and wipe out the crop, or there wasn't enough rain, and so they had to be resilient with things and, like, learn how to do something else when they weren't going to have the money come in for their crops. And so that's the thing with nature, is I wonder if God allows us to experience nature so that we can learn resiliency and grit, and so we can encourage our children to do that. Here's another one that I didn't anticipate putting in here, but some of you might be surprised by. Napping. Did you know napping encourages resiliency and grit? Children who nap 30 to 60 minutes midday at least 3 times a week are happier, have more self-control and grit, and showcase fewer behavioral problems according to new research. These children also have higher IQs and excel academically. This is like the trifecta of everything. Just put your kids to sleep. The midday nap is easily implemented and it costs nothing, says Lou, particularly if accompanied by a slightly later end to the day. That doesn't mean they go to bed later. This is talking about their educational time at school, if that ends later, to avoid cutting into educational time. So she's suggesting that they actually make the educational day longer and then put a nap in the middle. Not only will this help the kids, but it also takes away time for screen use. That's another good thing, which is related to a lot of mixed outcomes. Okay, here's the kicker though. Anybody want to guess the age that they went up to for this napping study? I think I heard it actually. 12 years old. I know a lot of parents that would like to take a nap midday, and that would help with their resiliency and grit. So definitely 12-year-olds would benefit from this. I thought that was pretty cool. So if you think your kids are too old for naps, nope. It actually builds resiliency and grit. Another thing, and I think this is really important, tell your kids the truth. I hear a lot of parents that don't want to tell their kids the truth because they don't want to hurt their feelings, or they don't want to, to bother them, or they want to, make promises they can't necessarily keep because it sounds better than the truth. But lying suggests you don't trust your child to handle the truth. Lying also suggests they won't find out eventually anyway. What happens when kids find out about the tooth fairy and Santa? And you know how many horror stories I've heard as a therapist about kids finding out these things after they've been lied to for years? Lying also distorts the expectations your child has of what might happen and how to plan for it, thus giving them no way to truly succeed. Here are some ways that we lie to our kids, because I think sometimes we don't realize we're doing this. Like, those kids don't hate you, they're just jealous of you. What if your kid is really a brat, though? Do you really want to say this and encourage them to think that the only reason the other kids don't like them is because they're just jealous? Or what if the kids are just really mean, and it's important to talk to them about sometimes there are kids in this world that no matter what you do, they're just not going to like you? That sort of thing. How about we can't afford that? Now, sometimes you can't afford it. But what happens when your kid sees you buy something else that you just want? And you've already said, but we can't afford that. And they're like, but you bought this. I thought we couldn't afford it. How about saying instead, it's not a priority right now? That's more honest than we can't afford it, because you might want to buy something later and they're like, I thought we didn't have any money. How about I promise to take you if you finish all your homework? That doesn't seem like a lie. But what if something else comes up? Or what if they throw a tantrum even though they finish their homework? Are you still going to take them? Not necessarily. So sometimes you can say, my intention is to take you. Doing your homework will help, but there are some other things that could stop me from taking you too. So I hope you'll do your best to make sure we get to go. Another thing is strengths-based parenting. The tendency for parents to see and encourage children to use their strengths relates to lower stress and higher life satisfaction in adolescence. Strengths are defined as capacities, characteristics, and processes that are energizing and authentic and are manifested through patterns and thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Strengths can be considered moral virtues, such as honesty, talent such as creative writing ability, or big five personality traits such as conscientiousness. They are stable over time, like a trait, but also dynamic and alterable by environmental influences and effort. So what does this mean? A lot of times we like to compliment our kids on extrinsic things, like, oh, the way you look, or, oh, you know, you're so pretty today, or those kinds of things. But what if we focus more on character traits we want to encourage versus just the outward things? So adolescents who see their parents as strength-based report greater strengths use. So when you're focusing on those strengths that that child has, they wind up using them more, especially when they have a growth mindset about their strengths and greater subjective well-being. In recent years, a series of studies have found promising indications that children and adolescents have greater well-being when they have parents who identify and encourage their strengths. What does that mean for parents? You really have to pay attention to each of your kids to get to know those things. All your kids aren't going to be the same. Anybody have all of their kids and they're exactly the same personality, temperament, creative abilities, that sort of thing? No, so you really have to pay attention to your child and see the things that they tend to do well with. And here's a quote that you can use almost in any situation to encourage strengths-based parenting. It might be hard, but I trust you will find a way to meet this challenge. Anytime your child has a discouragement or a challenge or something like that, you can use this quote with them. It might be hard, but I trust you will find a way to meet this challenge. Do you think you could say that? What does that do for your child? Yeah, it gives them confidence to try. Like, wow, my parent believes in me. They know me. They must know me well enough to know that I can do this, so maybe I can. Another thing that's encouraging is feelings are not facts. A lot of times we focus on feelings, and feelings are important, but not more important than the facts. And so we want to encourage children to recognize how their feelings are in line with facts. Well, what does that mean? If I'm excited about something, but it's bad for me, should I be excited? Not necessarily. So we can encourage kids, like, just because you're excited doesn't mean that's good for you. But it's good to notice when you're feeling something, does it line up with what's actually good for us? That encourages them to use different parts of their brain too. So do you want to take a quiz to see how good you are at resiliency and grit? Angela Duckworth developed a grit scale. 1, here you can just keep track of your answers. New ideas and projects sometimes distract me from previous ones. And these are all on a rating of very much like me, mostly like me, somewhat like me, not much like me, or not like me at all. Number 2, setbacks don't encourage me. I don't give up easily. Number 3, I often set a goal but later choose to pursue a different one. I am a hard worker. Number 5, I have difficulty maintaining my focus on projects that take more than a few months to complete. 6, I finish whatever I begin. How many of you have projects at home you haven't finished? If you're in that line of work, like say if you're in carpentry, you probably have a lot of carpentry projects at home you haven't finished. My interests change from year to year. Number 8, I am diligent. I never give up. Number 9, I have been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time, but later lost interest. I remember when I was growing up, my sister was bound and determined to get a certain set of china to put in this hope chest. Nobody in my family ever talked about a hope chest, but she had it in her mind that she was going to have a hope chest and put her wedding china in it. The problem is it wasn't wedding china that had been passed down to her. She really wanted to go to Macy's and buy this wedding china when she was in high school. The problem is we all knew, every single person in my family knew that my sister changed her mind all the time. How expensive is wedding china? We were like, don't do it. You're going to change your mind. Don't do it. She didn't actually buy the wedding china, but we're all glad because I know today she would not have liked that blue flowered wedding china that she was so obsessed with. And number 10, I have overcome setbacks to conquer an important challenge. How did you do? Are you resilient? Do you have a lot of grit? Well, you can work on it. So all of these things together will help build resiliency and grit. And I just want to leave a shameful plug for our podcast, because we just had a podcast today that we recorded, Dr. Binus and I, on victor versus victim mentality. So you can look forward to that, and that has to do with resiliency and grit too in the face of challenges. And so I'll leave you with that, and thank you so much for coming. Would you like me to pray? Okay, I'll pray to end up. Dear Father in heaven, I want to thank you so much that in a world full of challenges and even sometimes discouragements, that you have given us hope. Your word says, I have not given you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. So Lord, we want to take all of those promises of power, love, and a sound mind and recognize that they are from you. And if they're from you, we can hope in those things too. So thank you so much for the minds that you've given us, that you've created and you want to recreate in us, and help us to be resilient to the things that come to us. But Lord, we know that we can't do that on our own. And in a world full of people that don't believe in you, Lord, we thank you that you've given us the opportunity to look to you when we feel weak, that you will make us strong. And so because of those things, we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.